In the heart of Jerusalem's Old City, beneath a marble floor that had not been lifted in centuries, archaeologists recently uncovered something that connects directly to one of the most famous passages in the entire New Testament. Not a hidden chamber full of gold, not some sensational secret the church supposedly kept buried for 2,000 years, something far quieter, far more scientific, and honestly far more compelling once you understand exactly what it means. Underneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site venerated by billions of Christians throughout history as the location of Jesus' crucifixion and burial, researchers pulled ancient soil samples, ran them through modern laboratory analysis, and found traces of something that lines up almost perfectly. We are going to walk through exactly what was found, how scientists confirmed it, and to understand why this discovery matters, you first need to understand the building itself, because the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is genuinely unlike almost any other religious site on earth. According to long-standing Christian tradition, this church sits directly on top of two of the most significant locations in the entire Christian faith, Golgotha, the hill where the crucifixion is said to have taken place, and the nearby tomb where Jesus' body was laid to rest afterward. The current structure, standing today, was largely completed in the 12th century during the era of the Crusaders, but it sits on the foundations of a much earlier basilica, first dedicated back in 335 CE. Built under the direction of the Roman Emperor Constantine, the first Roman ruler to convert to Christianity and legalize the religion across his empire. Over the centuries, the site has been damaged, rebuilt, expanded, and renovated repeatedly, which means that beneath its current floor lie layers upon layers of history stacked one on top of another, like the pages of an ancient book nobody had fully read. The story of the most recent set of discoveries actually starts back in October of 2016. When researchers were finally granted permission to lift the marble slab covering what is traditionally venerated as the burial bed of Jesus, located inside a small shrine within the church called the Botanical. That marble covering had not been moved since at least the year 1555, and some historians believed it may not have been disturbed since the era of the Crusaders centuries earlier. When a team from the National Technical, University of Athens, carefully lifted that slab, they discovered a layer of fill material underneath, and beneath that, yet another marble slab, this one carved with a cross. It was an emotional moment for the researchers involved, since nobody alive had any certainty about what, if anything, remained of the original rock-cut tomb beneath all those centuries of accumulated stone and mortar. That 2016 investigation eventually allowed scientists to date mortar samples taken from between the layers of that inner tomb structure. The results placed the mortar at approximately 345 CE, which falls squarely within the reign of Constantine and lines up precisely with when his original church was constructed. What that means, in practical terms, is that the burial bed pilgrims and tourists visit inside the Botanical today was already sealed beneath marble within just a decade or two of Constantine's builders finishing their original church. In other words, the tomb identified as sacred by Constantine's mother, Helena, back in the year 326 CE, appears to be the very same physical tomb that continues to be venerated at that exact location today, without some later relocation, some quiet swap, or some medieval reinvention. The physical continuity, at least architecturally, checks out. That earlier investigation set the stage for an even more ambitious excavation effort that began in 2022, when the church badly needed floor restoration work due to decades of deterioration. Leading that project is Professor Francesca Romana Stasola of Sapienza University of Rome, working in careful coordination with the three main Christian communities that jointly oversee the site, the Franciscans representing the custody of the Holy Land, the Greek Orthodox Church, and the Armenian Church, alongside Israel's Antiquities Authority. What began as a fairly routine restoration project quickly transformed into what researchers have called one of the most intricate and significant archaeological operations ever conducted anywhere in the Holy Land. If stories like this genuinely interest you, go ahead and hit that like button. It really helps this kind of careful, fact-based content reach more curious people. As Stasola's team worked their way down through the ancient layers beneath the church floor, they uncovered evidence stretching back much further than the Christian era altogether. Deep beneath the more recent construction, researchers found remnants of an ancient stone quarry, dating all the way back to the Iron Age, somewhere between 1200 and 586 BCE. At some later point, that abandoned quarry site was repurposed for agricultural use, and this is exactly where the story takes its most fascinating turn. Through a specialized technique called Archaeobotanical analysis, essentially studying ancient seeds and pollen preserved in the soil, researchers examined samples pulled from directly beneath the church floor and identified the preserved remains of olive trees and grapevines, dated to roughly 2,000 years old, right around the time period traditionally associated with the crucifixion and burial of Jesus. Here's why that specific detail matters so much. The Gospel of John, in chapter 19, verse 41, contains a remarkably specific description of the burial location. It states that in the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in that garden, a new tomb where no one had yet been laid. For centuries, that detail existed purely as a piece of scriptural text, something read, discussed, and depicted in religious art, but never independently verified through physical evidence. Now, nearly 2,000 years later, archaeologists digging in soil sealed beneath a church floor have found actual physical traces of cultivated plants, olive trees, and grapevines specifically, exactly the kind of vegetation you would expect to find growing in a private garden setting during that same historical period. Professor Stasola's team confirmed this discovery represents the first time actual botanical evidence for a garden at this specific location has ever been documented. It is also worth understanding the broader historical geography here because it adds an important layer of context. During the time period traditionally associated with Jesus, this entire area sat outside the walls of Jerusalem, in keeping with Jewish burial customs of that era, which required tombs and burial grounds to be located beyond a city's walls rather than within them. It was not until the 2nd century, under the Roman Emperor Hadrian, that Jerusalem was substantially rebuilt and renamed Aelia Capitolina, with the city's boundaries expanding to eventually enclose what had previously been an outlying area. That expansion is precisely why a location that began as a quarry, then became agricultural land with a garden, and eventually held burial tombs, ultimately ended up enclosed inside a major church built directly in the center of the city we recognize today. Excavations throughout the site have also confirmed something else worth knowing, which is that the area surrounding the traditional tomb of Jesus was not an isolated, solitary burial spot. Multiple ancient burial sites have been documented within the broader Holy Sepulchre complex, consistent with how burial grounds from that era commonly operated, with several tombs clustered together in a shared area rather than existing as a single isolated grave. According to long-standing Christian tradition, one of these nearby tombs is believed to be that of Joseph of Arimathea, the wealthy follower described in the Gospels as having offered his own personal burial chamber for Jesus' body after the crucifixion. When Constantine's builders arrived in the 4th century, historical accounts and archaeological evidence suggest they specifically identified and isolated the tomb long venerated as Jesus' burial place, physically separating it from the surrounding burial complex and constructing the rotunda that still defines the church's layout today. If you enjoy this kind of careful, well-researched dive into archaeology and history, consider subscribing, since there is a lot more of this kind of content coming. Now, it is genuinely important to be clear and careful about exactly what this kind of archaeological evidence can and cannot tell us, because that distinction matters enormously, especially with a topic this significant to so many people. What researchers have found is solid, physical, scientifically dated evidence that this specific location matches the general environmental description recorded in the Gospel of John, a garden setting containing olive trees and grapevines, located just outside the ancient city walls, dating to approximately the correct historical period. What this evidence cannot do, and what no archaeological find realistically could do, is definitively prove the theological claims connected to this site, such as confirming that this particular tomb specifically held the body of Jesus, or providing physical evidence related to the resurrection itself. Archaeology works by examining physical remains and comparing them against historical and textual records. It can establish whether a described physical setting plausibly existed at a specific place and time. It cannot verify the truth of a religious event that, by its very nature, falls outside what physical evidence alone is capable of confirming or denying. Professor Stasola herself has been notably careful and measured about exactly this distinction throughout the project, emphasizing that regardless of where any individual's personal belief falls regarding the historical authenticity of the tomb specifically belonging to Jesus, the location has been venerated by countless generations of people for close to 2,000 years, and that continuous, layered history of devotion has profoundly shaped both the site itself and the wider history of Jerusalem as a city. That framing matters because it allows the archaeological findings to stand on their own scientific merit as genuinely fascinating. Historical evidence, without requiring anyone watching this to resolve deeper questions of personal faith in order to appreciate just how remarkable it is that researchers can pull 2,000-year-old pollen grains out of soil sealed beneath a church floor and match them against a description written down in an ancient religious text. The excavation work itself has continued to expand well beyond just the garden findings and the earlier tomb investigation. Researchers working across various sections of the church have documented pottery fragments, architectural remnants from Constantine's original 4th century basilica, and detailed technical evidence about the construction methods used by his ancient builders, particularly in the church's north aisle, where archaeologists have been able to retrace excavation trenches originally dug decades earlier by previous generations of researchers working at the site. The team has also employed modern technology throughout the project, including 3-dimensional digital mapping and ground-penetrating radar, allowing them to build an increasingly detailed digital reconstruction of the site's full layered history without needing to physically disturb every single section of ancient stone and soil. Because the Church of the Holy Sepulchre remains an active site of worship, visited daily by pilgrims and tourists from around the world, the excavation work has had to proceed carefully and often in segmented portions, pausing entirely during major religious observances like Holy Week and Easter, when the church fills with visitors marking the very events this archaeological research is quietly investigating from underneath their feet. Full scientific analysis of the vast collection of artifacts recovered. Throughout this ongoing project is expected to take years to complete, and researchers involved have publicly hinted that additional findings, beyond what has already been announced, remain in the pipeline as laboratory analysis continues. Alongside the botanical and structural evidence, the team has also recovered thousands of smaller artifacts scattered throughout the excavated layers, including coins, glass fragments, and pieces of decorated pottery spanning many different centuries, each one adding another small data point to the larger timeline researchers are gradually piecing together. Cataloging and properly analyzing a collection of that size, especially at a site with such a long and layered history of continuous use, is itself a slow and painstaking process. One that specialists say could realistically continue for the better part of a decade before every artifact has been properly documented, dated, and published in peer-reviewed academic literature. There is something genuinely striking about the timeline involved in all of this. The marble slab covering the traditional tomb sat completely undisturbed for roughly 450 years before that 2016 investigation finally lifted it. Once resealed, researchers may not get another opportunity to examine that specific area again for decades, meaning the window during which this particular generation of scientists could study these details directly was remarkably brief in the grand scope of the Church's nearly 2 millennia of continuous history. The combination of rare access, careful modern scientific technique, and a discovery that happens to align so specifically with an ancient written account is exactly what makes this story worth paying attention to, regardless of where any individual viewer personally stands on matters of faith. There is a broader scientific principle at work here too, worth pausing on, because it explains exactly how researchers can be so confident about dating something as fragile and seemingly ephemeral as ancient pollen grains and seed remnants. Archaeobotany, the specific branch of archaeology focused on recovering and analyzing plant remains from ancient sites, relies on the remarkable fact that certain plant materials, particularly pollen grains and carbonized seeds, can survive for thousands of years when preserved under the right, sealed, low-oxygen conditions. Pollen grains, in particular, have a tough outer coating that resists decay remarkably well, meaning that even after 2,000 years buried beneath layers of stone, mortar, and marble, scientists can still extract identifiable plant material and determine, often down to the specific species, exactly what kind of vegetation was growing at a location centuries or even millennia in the past. Combined with radiocarbon dating techniques, which measure the predictable decay of radioactive carbon isotopes within organic material to estimate its age, researchers can build a remarkably precise picture of what an ancient landscape actually looked like long before any written record was ever created to describe it. This is not the first time archaeobotanical evidence has played a significant role in evaluating claims connected to biblical era sites either. Similar techniques have been used at various locations throughout the Holy Land to study everything from ancient agricultural practices to the specific crops cultivated by communities living during the time of the Hebrew Bible and New Testament. What makes the Church of the Holy Sepulchre findings particularly noteworthy within that broader body of research is the remarkably specific nature of the textual claim being tested. Most archaeobotanical work in the region focuses on broader questions about diet, agriculture, or regional ecology. Here, researchers were essentially testing one single precise sentence written by an ancient author nearly 2,000 years ago, and the physical evidence pulled directly from the soil happened to align with that sentence in a way that even the most cautious, skeptical archaeologist would have to acknowledge as a genuinely striking correlation. It is also worth understanding a bit more about the political and religious complexity involved in simply gaining access to conduct. This kind of research in the first place, since the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is not administered by any single religious authority. Instead, the site operates under what is sometimes called the status quo, a set of long-standing agreements dating back centuries between the various Christian denominations sharing custodianship of the church, primarily the Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Armenian Apostolic communities, alongside smaller roles held by the Coptic, Ethiopian, and Syriac Orthodox churches as well. These arrangements are famously delicate, governing everything down to which specific community has the right to clean a particular staircase or move a particular ladder. And disputes over even minor changes to the physical space have occasionally led to tension between the different communities sharing the site. Securing genuine cooperative agreement across all of these different stakeholders to conduct a major, invasive archaeological excavation beneath the church floor represents a significant diplomatic and logistical achievement in its own right, entirely separate from the archaeological findings themselves. The 2016 investigation into the tomb itself also revealed something else worth mentioning: a layer of fill material sandwiched between the two marble slabs covering the burial bed, dating to the Crusader period roughly 800 years ago. This tells researchers that the tomb structure has been reinforced, protected, and physically maintained across multiple distinct historical eras, first by Constantine's 4th century builders, then again by Crusader era craftsmen centuries later, and finally through the more recent marble covering added around 1555. Each layer represents a different generation of caretakers, working across vastly different political and religious circumstances, all taking deliberate steps to protect and preserve what they understood to be the same sacred location, a continuity of care and veneration stretching across nearly 17 centuries of recorded history. Beyond the garden and tomb findings specifically, the broader excavation project, led by Professor Stasola's team, has also shed considerable new light on the engineering techniques used by Constantine's 4th century construction crews, details that were previously known mostly through brief historical descriptions rather than direct physical evidence. Researchers examining the church's north aisle have been able to trace and document the actual construction trenches dug by those ancient builders, revealing practical information about how they approached quarrying, leveling, and structurally integrating the existing rock formations into their new basilica design. This kind of technical archaeological detail rarely generates dramatic headlines the way a discovery tied directly to a biblical passage does, but it represents an equally important part of understanding exactly how this remarkable building came together in the first place, nearly 1700 years ago, using construction methods and resources available to the late Roman Empire. It's also worth noting that this entire excavation project unfolds within a uniquely challenging working environment, since the Church of the Holy Sepulchre remains, first and foremost, an active house of worship, rather than a museum or purely historical site. Daily religious services continue throughout the church, even as archaeological work proceeds nearby, and researchers must constantly balance the demands of careful, methodical scientific investigation against the needs and schedules of the religious communities who consider this ground sacred and continue actively using it for prayer and ceremony every single day. That balancing act between rigorous modern science and centuries of continuous living religious practice adds a layer of complexity to this project that most archaeological excavations simply never have to navigate. What makes this entire excavation genuinely remarkable at the end of the day is not that it definitively resolves questions that have occupied theologians, historians, and believers for 2,000 years, because it does not, and honestly, no archaeological dig realistically could. What makes it remarkable is the sheer fact that modern science, careful radiocarbon dating, detailed pollen analysis, and painstaking archaeological excavation has been able to reach back across nearly 2 full millennia and pull tangible, physical, testable evidence out of the ground that lines up with a specific, detailed description written down by an ancient author, describing a garden that stood in this exact spot at roughly this exact moment in history. Whatever conclusions each individual person draws from that alignment, the discovery itself stands as a genuinely fascinating example of how much the ground beneath our feet still has left to tell us, even at a location that countless generations of people have walked across, prayed within, and studied for the better part of 2,000 years.